Good evening, welcome. My name is Alexander Carpenter. I'm the director of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies here at the University of Alberta. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Telus Center, to our annual Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust Lecture. This campus and community-wide public lecture is made possible by the support of the broader Edmonton community, as well as Mr. Saul and Mrs. Toby Reichert. Saul Reichert was born in Pabianice in Poland. He was 9 years old at the outbreak of World War II. Following the German occupation of their hometown, Saul's family's home, business, and possessions were plundered, and they were forced to resettle in the Łódź ghetto. From there, they were eventually shipped to the notorious Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Upon arriving there, Saul was separated from his mother and sister and never saw them again. Saul managed to survive and was liberated by U.S. troops in May of 1945. The Reicherts regard the Wirth Institute's lecture series as a way of keeping knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust alive among future generations of students, not only serving the purpose of commemorating the tragedy, but as a cautionary epistle against such monumental injustices perpetrated on the innocent. The 2024 Reichert Lecture will be presented by Dr. Sarah Cramsey. Dr. Cramsey is a special chair for Central European Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, an assistant professor of Judaism and Diaspora Studies, and director of the Austria Center, Leiden. From 2025 to 2030, she will be the principal investigator of A Century of Care, Invisible Work and Early Child Care in Central and Eastern Europe, 1905 to 2004, or Care Century. This is a project funded by a European Research Council starting grant. She is a historian of Central and Eastern Europe, the global Jewish experience throughout historical time, and the significant Jewish diasporas unleashed from the lands between Berlin and Moscow as a result of the Holocaust, World War II, and post-war events. Dr. Cramsey received her doctorate in late modern European history with a designated emphasis in Jewish studies from the University of California, Berkeley in 2014. Since then, she has taught courses on modern European history, Central and Eastern Europe, Jewish studies, and religious studies at the University of California, Berkeley, Tulane University, and the Free University of Brussels. Her first book, Uprooting the Diaspora, Jewish Belonging and the Ethnic Revolution in Poland and Czechoslovakia, 1936 to 1946, was published by the Modern Jewish Experience series at Indiana University Press in 2023. It was named a finalist for the Ernst Fraenkel Prize for the Best Book on the Holocaust by the Wiener Library, and it won the 2024 Kulczycki Prize for Best Book in Polish Studies from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Affairs. And if I'm not wrong, Dr. Cramsey will leave Edmonton to go to Boston to receive this prestigious book prize. Her talk today deals with a fascinating and long-neglected topic with respect to the Holocaust, namely the experience of young children and their caregivers. In her words, the youngest victims, the smallest survivors, and the people who sustained them. And she notes that the inattention to the invisible work of caretaking in existing Holocaust histories is surprising, exceptional, and intellectually dangerous. Her groundbreaking work promises to be an important addition to, and dare I say, corrective to the historical study of the Holocaust and its aftermath. I'm so delighted that Dr. Cramsey is able to be with us today in Edmonton for the Wirth Institute's Jewish Studies Week to deliver the 2024 Reichert Lecture. Sarah is not only a very fine and very important scholar, but also a fellow Austrian Center director, a valued colleague, and a friend. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Sarah Cramsey.
I'd like to think that of all of the Austria Center directors, and there are 9 Austria Centers throughout the world, that you and I have the best hair. So I am committed to that. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today. In Edmonton. This is my first time to Western Canada, even though I lived for quite a long time in Berkeley, California, but I was a very poor graduate student and working all the time. So I didn't have time to head due north. So I'm so happy and grateful to be here. Thank you so much to the Jewish community of Edmonton. Thank you very much to the family of Toby and Saul Reichert. Thank you very much to the committee that worked in conjunction with the Worth Institute to decide to bring me here. And a very special thanks to Joe and Alexander, who are very, very dear colleagues through the Austria Center, and also as we've just gotten to know each other's work. I also need to thank Sylvia and Rochelle, who have helped bring me here. And so thank you all around. I'm very, very honored to be here and speak with you about my new book, Care, Children, and the Other Holocaust. So I'm here to tell you something that you already know. Care matters, and it matters in many ways. It matters for all of us on an individual level. Our lives are bookended and punctuated by care. But care also matters as a scientific, historical concept that is seemingly timeless, always contingent, and a surprisingly underutilized tool in the study of the human past. To put it another way, care is constant, but it's almost always changing. It responds to technological advances, material revolutions, persistent moral assumptions, and shifting political economies. It is often infused with religious, ethnic, and cultural sensitivities. We create care practices, and care practices transcend us. And if we theorize it, care, with a capital C, becomes a social entity that changes in composition over time. When I talk about care these days, I'm usually talking about early childcare, or the care which transpires during the earliest days of human life, in the womb, and for a handful of years after birth. As I look around this room, filled with people who support Jewish studies and Central European studies at the Worth Institute and have traveled both near and far to be here, I know, just by looking at all of you, that all of us received this early childcare. I'm certain of that. You all survived that fragile period which begins the human existence. What is uncertain, however, is where historians, like me, and others who study the past, can find the physical, documentary, and archival proof of that care which sustained you. Because while early childcare is obvious, it is often invisible to the written record. The person receiving the care, especially the young children, have no memory of it. Those giving the care are consumed by that care and are often too busy or too tired to write about it. Caregivers are often women whose perspective has frequently been marginalized. The work of early child care is often taboo. It is sometimes quite dirty and largely undocumented. And so, the invisible work attached to early child care is by definition difficult to visualize. That's exactly what I want to try to do today, using a specific laboratory, the Jewish catastrophe in Central Europe during the Second World War. Specifically, I will visualize the invisible work of caretakers who nurtured the very young during the Shoah, the event that came to be known as the Holocaust with a capital H. How will I do this? And I can hear at least the historians amongst you asking, so what? Why does this matter? Let me answer those questions now explicitly and hope that in the minutes which follow, I can strengthen those answers with evidence. This is the time to really zoom into what I'm saying, and then you can zoom out later on. I'll give you my thesis statement now at the beginning. Can you tell I'm used to teaching 18-year-olds? I need to give it to them like straight at the beginning. I will visualize the work of caretakers during the Shoah by reading pre-existing documents in creative ways, and by focusing on overlooked voices, spaces, and things that illuminate care in the past. So what? We already know so much about the Holocaust, or the systematic discrimination, uprooting, robbery, starvation, and murdering of European Jews from 1933 to 1945. Why should we think about this event from the standpoint of caretakers and the children who received care? Isn't genocide always gendered? Isn't the decision taken by Nazi officials in the late summer and early fall of 1941 to kill hundreds of thousands of Jewish women and children by bullets on the Eastern Front, as detailed by Christopher Browning and others, already held up as a moment that the Third Reich crossed a line and became a genocidal state? Am I really telling you something new? In fact, I began this talk by admitting that today I will tell you something that you already know. What else am I contributing to conversations about the Holocaust, about the broader experience of Jews rooted in Central and Eastern Europe, and about the importance of care for the broader study of the human past? An answer to these complicated questions begins with an admission. I've always taught that the Holocaust is unique compared to other genocides on 3 registers. 1, the long history of anti-Judaism in Christian Europe. 2, the metaphysical nature of the Jew and Nazi ideology. And 3, the pan-European nature of the crime, which implicates so many actors, from railway operators to machine makers to government officials and ordinary neighbors. But I have begun to realize that this explanation is incomplete. The chronological length, the geographic breadth, and the daily processes that added up to this genocide demand that we pay attention to caretaking as an active relationship and those imbricated in those relationships. The Nazis and some of their collaborators weaponized care and networks attached to care as they perpetrated the Holocaust. I think that this explicit manipulation of care to advance genocide also makes the Holocaust unique in the field of genocide studies. And on a tangent, I'm interested to see how specialists of other genocides integrate care into the narratives that they write. Stemming from this realization, a more specific argument that I'd like to make today is that we should understand the experience of caretaking as being the dominant experience of Jews during the 1940s. And here, I understand the word Jews to correspond to those classified as Jewish according to the 1935 Nuremberg laws. Thus, if we are not studying the invisible work of care and caretaking, we are not really grappling with the events that added up to this genocide, nor are we representing the actual lived past accurately. Beyond this, a focus on care illuminates survival and unsurvival, the extensive uprootedness for Jews of all ages during the 1940s, and finally, the invisible work of care during extraordinary times. In fact, it is precisely during periods of uprooting, displacement, and forced migration that care and care networks become more visible. This holds true for the 3 case studies that I will present today, which all involve Polish Jewish caregivers and those whom they cared for, and some Polish Jews attentive to care. These case studies, which happened during the first half of the 1940s, reveal the other Holocaust, or the specific genocide directed at the youngest victims of the Shoah and those who nurtured them. Moving forward, we will look at this other Holocaust in 3 places: the Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the wartime Soviet Union. Because of the spread of this survey and the nature of the evidence that we will digest, I think it's necessary to say 2 more things before I proceed. 2 things that I often say to my students when I teach about this event. First, the Holocaust happened in different ways, in different places. We need to be attentive to local, regional, and global circumstances simultaneously. And second, today we are talking about a very sensitive topic, the Holocaust, and within that sensitive topic, we are considering highly sensitive documents and stories. Some of this lecture may be triggering for people, especially those who have suffered pregnancy loss or the loss of a cared-for child. I am familiar with these feelings. I still think the emotional stamina required for this work is possible and necessary. This is a perspective that we cannot ignore. I'll begin this first section on the Warsaw Ghetto, which existed from November 1940 to May 1943, from a very different time and place. On May 3rd, 1961, during the 25th session of the State of Israel's trial against Adolf Eichmann, Zhivia Lubetkin took the stand. She wore a plain collared dress with large buttons that cinched at the waist with the help of a belt. After she was sworn in, she was seated in the witness chair, across from the glass box containing the accused, Adolf Eichmann, and next to the table where the chief prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, stood, with his black robe, thin black tie, and crossed arms. With gravity, he asked her, what happened in April 1943, before Easter, before Pesach, unquote. He wanted her to talk about how she and other Polish Jews initiated the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising during Passover, a springtime festival commemorated by Jews annually. Lubetkin swallowed, ran her tongue across her bottom teeth, staring downward for most of this part and twisting her glasses in her hand. She began an answer that is shocking, to say the least. Let me quote her in full. The 18th of April, 1943, was the day before Pesach. 2 days earlier, the Gestapo man Brand walked into the community council office and said that he believed that the council does not take care enough of the Jewish children. There was not enough food, not enough vegetables, and he suggested that kindergartens would be put up so that Jewish children could play and laugh, because it was certain that Jews would remain in Warsaw and should be productive, and that there would be no danger of deportation. We already had experience, and we knew that if there were any rumors, and if there was such a promise, that it was a bad omen. Rumors reverberated through the ghetto during those heavy April days, which Czesław Miłosz, a non-Jewish Pole who lived on the other side of the ghetto wall, captured so viscerally in his poem Campo di Fiori, in which Miłosz details how the flames from the burning ghetto passed by the children's carousel in a park on the Aryan side of the city. Even positive rumors, however, did not encourage Lubetkin and other fighters in the ZOB, the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, or the Jewish Combat Organization. Further intelligence confirmed what Lubetkin and others already expected. By midnight, on April 18th, the ghetto was surrounded by Nazi German soldiers, readying for intensive battle. Now, to me, this is extraordinary. In advance of the Nazi ground assault on the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the 4 largest urban insurrections in the 20th century, and the largest insurrection in any part of Nazi-occupied Europe, the Nazi official who liaisoned with the Warsaw Jewish community tried to divert Jewish attention and ameliorate Jewish fears by making promises to improve the lives of Jewish children. This mass manipulation was embedded in the broader Nazi strategy for liquidating the Jewish community of Warsaw, which was the second largest urban settlement of Jews in the world after New York City in the 1940s, and roughly 1/3 of the city's overall population. There were also tens of thousands of Jews from elsewhere in Poland who had been resettled there. And perhaps even more extraordinarily, members of the Jewish fighting organization, like Zhivia Lubetkin, were prepared to take up the meager arms they had stored and protected because they heard about a Nazi initiative to reopen kindergartens, give Jewish children more vegetables, and encourage play and laughter within the ghetto walls? Why were these particular rumens, we might ask, understood as a bad omen? When Lubetkin said that she and her comrades already had experience which indicated otherwise, what did she mean? With this short reference, made nearly 2 decades after the event she described, Lubetkin gestured to another confluence of care and catastrophe from the spring and summer of 1942, from privileges given to Jewish children and their relieved caretakers before the so-called Great Deportation uprooted and massacred more than 250,000 Polish Jewish men, women, and children in the gas chambers of Treblinka. In April 1942, architects and engineers confined to the Warsaw Ghetto smoothed the jagged rubble of bombed-out spaces into artificial hills and valleys dotted with trees and flowers. Over the next few months, playgrounds took root in these newly created parks, thanks to an initiative of Adam Cherniakov, the president of the Nazi-created Warsaw Judenrat, who was not necessarily remembered in positive terms. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, diarist and lucky survivor Hillel Seidman remembered thousands of young children exercising in planned play spaces under the watchful eyes of their teachers. Yes, in April 1942, the Nazis allowed schools to open in the Warsaw Ghetto as well. As spring became summer, more playgrounds materialized. We know this because Adam Cherniakov followed the progress of Warsaw Ghetto playgrounds closely in his diary, which we can read today on screens that we carry in our pockets, because his diary was snuck out of the Warsaw Ghetto and preserved by courageous Polish Jews hiding on the Aryan side and courageous Polish Christians sympathetic to the Jewish plight. On June 24th, 1942, for example, Cherniakov inspected the work unfolding at 2 playgrounds. A few weeks later, he recorded the happy news that both spaces would be finished by Sunday, July 12th. At 9:30 in the morning on that day, crowds of people in the streets, on roofs, on chimneys and balconies watched the opening of the play area alongside an orchestra, choir, and ballet dances. The children gave Cherniakov an ovation, reflecting on his presence in play spaces, and at these ceremonies, he wrote that, quote, "Many people hold a grudge against me for organizing play activity for the children, for arranging festive openings of playgrounds. I am reminded of a film. A ship is sinking, and the captain, to raise the spirits of the passengers, orders the orchestra to play a jazz piece. I had my mind made up to emulate the captain," unquote. And so across 4 warming months in 1942, Cherniakov partook in ceremonies steeped in hope for a future that Jewish children in Warsaw could enjoy. Those of us who study how the Polish-Jewish civilization that coalesced in Warsaw began to come to a bloody end know that all this unfolded against a backdrop of other rumors, which hinted at the opposite. There would be no future for the Jews of Warsaw. The tension between these outcomes coexisted until a breaking point in the last week of July and would culminate in Cherniakov's protest suicide. 7 days before he died, on July 15, 1942, Cherniakov stopped by a new playground. It was full. On July 16th, Cherniakov recorded a new rumor suggesting that imminent deportations from the ghetto would leave only 120,000 people behind, or less than 25% of the existing ghetto population. On Saturday, July 18th, more precise rumors claimed that deportations would begin in just 2 days, on the evening of Monday, July 20th. Erupting panic drove Cherniakov towards 2 things. 1, medication. He took headache powders, pain relievers, and sedatives. And 2, playgrounds. He visited 3 on July 19th as he passed through the entire quarter, even on the last day of his life. Cherniakov included a reference to playgrounds alongside the horrific instructions that, quote, "All the Jews, irrespective of sex and age, with certain exceptions, will be deported to the east." 6,000 Jews were due to the Umschlagplatz at 4 p.m. That number would be a minimum daily quota, unquote. After Cherniakov and the Judenrat received this order from Sturmbannführer Hoffler, they disconnected their telephone and evacuated the children from the playground opposite their headquarters. At some moment thereafter, Cherniakov swallowed poison and died. Playgrounds and schools engendered optimism and passivity for Cherniakov and others at a particularly meaningful moment, right before the Great Deportation began. This is what I believe Zhivia Lubetkin referred to when asked about the timing of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as she sat opposite Adolf Eichmann in 1961. When the Nazis dangled improved care for Jewish children in front of her and her fellow fighters, they knew that this was part of an intentional strategy. From Warsaw, let us move to another place where the Holocaust happened, Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is a name that is familiar to you, I'm sure. Let me clarify a few things about this site, which lies around 3 kilometers away from the main camp Auschwitz I, seen here in a curated photo by one of my students. Auschwitz is the German name of a Polish town, the name of the first and main camp where working prisoners from more than a dozen countries were registered, and also a stand-in for a complex of work, labor, concentration, starvation, and death. There were 40 subcamps in this expansive network, which sits at an important railway junction and next to the town of Oswiecim, where Jews lived for more than 900 years. We will focus now on Birkenau, a subcamp built in 1941 and 1942 near the village of Brzezinka, where roughly 1 million people, mainly Jews, met their death by suffocation in 4 gas chambers. For context, 1 out of 6 Jews who died during the Holocaust died at the Auschwitz complex. Drawing on the artwork from a French-Polish Jew named David Olaire, voices from his colleagues in the Sonderkommando, and other writers who experienced Birkenau, we will clearly see that most of the women selected to die in gas-infused chambers experienced their trajectories to death as caregivers, with children in their charge. For some younger, healthy women, their role as a caretaker condemned them to death. The visceral art of David Olaire forces us where we cannot go, and from where there were almost no survivors, to the threshold of and then inside the gas chambers and crematorium. And when we arrive there, the children command our attention. Faceless, small beings wrapped in adult arms can be seen in one drawing sketched soon after unconditional surrender. In a 1945 plan of Birkenau's Crematoria 3, at least 3 of those standing in the gas chamber appear to hold miniature versions of themselves. They stand below 5 ovens, a room for the extraction of gold teeth, an area for the collection of hair, and bunks assigned to the Sonderkommando, who witnessed and became part of the final mechanisms of systematic murder. David Olaire could visualize this multi-level complex because he had been a, quote, slave of the crematorium himself for almost 2 years, beginning on March 2nd, 1943, when train convoy number 49 arrived in Auschwitz from Drancy in France. A highly regarded artist and naturalized French citizen who had been born in Warsaw in 1902, Olaire was arrested in a roundup near Paris on February 20th, 1943, and deported in a cattle car that chugged for roughly 1,500 kilometers eastward, back towards occupied lands which used to belong to the Second Polish Republic. After the war, he returned to France and shifted his gaze to Birkenau itself, perhaps to convince his disbelieving wife, who nursed him back to health with spoonfuls of pureed food, of what he had seen. Toys and baby bottles appear frequently in his work, sometimes clutched in the hands of live offspring, and sometimes discarded. A sketch entitled "I Watch the SS" that can be found at the ghetto fighter's house in Israel includes goods destined for tiny mouths, framed by the boots and legs of a guard, This drawing shows Olair as a Sonderkommando with life-saving access to things surrendered by those destined for the gas chambers. Things brought on the many-day or many-week-long trip to Birkenau. A baguette, a box of aspirin, suitcases and bags, and then, prominently, a baby bottle and a plump pacifier. A similar scene is captured in color in David Olair Collecting Food. Next to an abandoned pair of boots, a gaping cloth bag with kosher meat, a thin baguette, an apple, other perishable goods. Cast off next to this bag is a small, barefoot doll with a yellow dress and blue hair ribbon, and then a long baby bottle filled with milk. Things like this were discarded in the grass near the gas chambers. We can see evidence of this in the so-called Auschwitz album as well, which remains the only photographic proof of an arrival to Birkenau destined for work or death. This retention of carry-on items kept caretakers and those around them calm. Sometimes these goods were carried into the antechamber of the gas chamber, as seen in this drawing entitled In the Undressing Room of Crematoria 3, sketched in 1946. A rectangular room, replete with benches, hooks for discarded clothing, large pipes. A pillar and industrial lights contains 2 guards with rifles that steer the naked and almost naked people. 7 women and 5 children. The only character in the scene who we meet eye to eye is a child in the right corner of our view. When I first saw this picture, I knew that I had to write a book about care during the Holocaust. I also had a hunch that other Sonderkommando would provide me with details about the invisible work of this care at the end of life. One Sonderkommando prisoner, named Josef Sacker, remembered that, quote, people carried their parents in their arms, and 10-year-olds carried babies in their arms, unquote. The disrobing happened in shifts, and leading 2,000 people to the full capacity gas chamber took about an hour. Alongside the children, Sonderkommando charged with cleaning up the debris of the living often found food, eggs, meat, and fruit, both fresh and dried. Sacker remembered that, quote, many came with little children and had to feed them. They didn't know whether and when they would be given something to eat, unquote. Care, what we might call even miraculous care, continued even within the gas chamber as caretakers expired and lifeless bodies collapsed upon one another. On an otherwise normal day, filled with transport arrivals, Sonderkommando prisoner Shlomo Venenzia recalled hearing a strange noise as they removed bodies from the chamber. This was actually not that abnormal. Bodies, Venenzia explained, continued to emit gas, the so-called death rattle, but then the group working listened closely and realized that, quote, the wailing was the crying of a newborn baby. Barely 2 months old, Venenzia estimates, the baby was, quote, still clinging to her mother's breast and vainly trying to suckle. She was crying because she could feel that the milk had stopped flowing, unquote. Perhaps the baby girl was the same size as the one tethered to her caretaker in this gruesome drawing by David Olair. Venenzia's colleague brought the baby out of the gas chamber. We knew, he remembered, it would be impossible to keep her with us. Impossible to hide her or get her accepted by the Germans, unquote. Once the guard saw the baby, he shot it, and that little girl who had miraculously survived the gas was dead. This episode reaffirmed for Shlomo Venenzia the inevitability of death at Birkenau, what child survivor and historian Otto Dovkolka calls the immutable law in his gripping memoir, Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death. But Venenzia did survive his work with the Sonderkommando. Like Olair, he orbited away from planet Auschwitz, a phrase that takes on important resonance in the latest book of my colleague, Kate Brackney. Venenzia survived, And many years later, he asked the head of the largest pediatric hospital in Rome how that baby could have survived. According to this doctor, quote, "It was not impossible that the child, as she suckled, was insulated by the strength with which she was sucking at her mother's breast, which would have limited the absorption of the deadly gas," unquote. Venenzia once shared this story with school children after one small girl asked him if anyone survived the gas chamber. Yes, but only one. David O'Leary's artistic attention even focused on life not yet born. Tucked into a formed belly, a diaphanous, breached fetus is left of center in this very difficult scene. Entitled Gassing, this large, blue, gray, brown, red painting shows a bloodied canister of Zyklon B emitting gas that ensnarls roughly 17 people in an agonizing state. With open mouths and sometimes open eyes, their naked limbs twist towards each other. The memoirs of Sonderkommando Leb Langfuss, which were scribbled on precious paper and buried in the ground near the crematorium, corroborates this entanglement. Quote, "Falling down dead in such a confined space, the people pressed against each other in 5 or 6 layers, one on top of the other to over a meter in height," unquote. He noticed that, quote, "mothers were left sitting on the ground, clutching their children, men and women hugging each other," unquote. Was this expectant mother, we might ask, pregnant when she arrived at Birkenau? Or, like the mother of Otto Dovkolka, did she conceive at Auschwitz? Naomi Seidman, the daughter of the diarist Hillel Seidman, who I cited earlier, her work reminds us that intentional sex, pregnancy, and birth happened even in the most desperate locations during the Holocaust. Other fetuses figure in my research on care as well. In the 1980s, for example, the Conference for Material Claims Against Germany struck an agreement with the West German government about a new classification of Holocaust survivors, the so-called fetus category. Thus, babies born to Jewish mothers, even after May 1945, were eligible for survivor benefits. More than 2,500 claims in the fetus category have been approved for reparation payments. It's impossible, of course, to know how many fetuses were killed at Birkenau. What we do know, as scholar and survivor Ruth Kluger reminds us, is that only the Jewish and Roma children died in gas chambers en masse. Ruth Kluger had other things to say about childcare in the Auschwitz universe, which are relevant here. She was a child herself when she arrived in Birkenau with her mother. They had a complicated relationship, and Kluger did not want observers of the Holocaust, or really any past, to idealize care relationships based on biology. The texture of family relations, she wrote, becomes progressively more threadbare when people have to put up with more, unquote. Still, Kluger contended that family obligations precluded some behavior, like child abandonment. She used a critique of a fictional scene written by Polish Sonderkommando Tadeusz Borowski to make her point. In the short story, This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, Borowski visualizes a youthful Jewish mother arriving at Birkenau and then attempting to abandon her child, even as the child chases after her. Borowski acknowledges in his text, the mother wanted to live. Like Borowski and fellow prisoner Im Kurtesh, Kluger also wrote about the moment of arrival on the deportation ramp at Birkenau. She called it, and I quote, "a blind alley of civilization gone berserk," unquote. She stood on a different deportation ramp than this one, which dates from spring 1944 and is pictured in the Auschwitz album, but I think the visual helps. For Kluger, the scene detailed by Borowski about the mother abandoning her offspring was unconvincing from two perspectives. First, as a woman who was a 12-year-old girl at that time on that very ramp, and one who lived for the rest of the war among older female prisoners. She said this in honor of the Jewish mothers who died and those who were kind to the children of other women. Leaning on Kluger and the memories of the Sonderkommando like David O'Lear, perhaps we should read the majority experience of female caretakers and their charges as an apogee of human caregiving. Hundreds of thousands of Janos Korczaks who have not been remembered with such gusto or commemoration. An irony of the Second World War is that more Polish Jews survived outside of Polish territory than on it. Around 250,000 Jews with Polish citizenship spent this conflict in the Soviet Union, alongside 1 million non-Jewish Polish citizens. As they moved around and lived in the Soviet Union indefinitely, this largely young population decided that wartime was also a good time to start or grow a family. By the time hundreds of thousands returned to post-war Poland in 1946, statistics that I have found in the Szczecin City Archive indicate that 1 out of 4 Polish Jews was under the age of 7, 1 out of 8 was under the age of 2. Perhaps this was why Miriam Storch said, quote, "The time in the Soviet Union was hard, but not for the reason you think. It was hard because we had to constantly take care of children," unquote. Children like the son of Esther Berkowitz, who was born on the weeks-long train trip that sent her and her husband from the western fringes of the expanded Soviet Union to a labor installation in Siberia. When she realized that she was in labor, the Soviets stopped the train and took her to a hospital where she gave birth. Her father-in-law became a primary caretaker of Daniel, her son. She had her second child in 1945. At labor installations, pregnant women often stayed behind with older women and older men to care for the children as the parents worked hard physical jobs. Polish Jewish women had to lean on others in the absence of strong family or communal ties. A local midwife taught Doris Abersteld to squeeze lemon juice into the mouths of breastfeeding children to strengthen the nutritional value of mother's milk. Women like Frida Waltzman were instructed by local Kazakhs to breastfeed their children for 2 years to ensure their nutritional strength, longer than what was customary in interwar Poland, but right around one of the defined limits recommended by rabbis in the Mishnah and the Talmud. It took Central Asian villages to raise these kids. Polish Jewish women, often expected to work in the Soviet labor system, left kids in daycares, at orphanages for the day, or with members of family, both biological and non-biological. 60 years after the war, Ruzhena Berler, who's here on the bottom, cherished a picture of Anastasia, who cared for her daughter. Decades after their time in the Soviet Union, dozens of parents, both mothers and fathers, remembered that train stations, important centers for the exchange of goods and information, almost always had rooms for babies, with hot water, cleaning products, and a space for nursing mothers. In times of scarcity, things attached to babies were often hard to procure, but not impossible. The black market provided a space to sell. Frida Waltzman's nightgown bought a month's worth of food in Jambul, and buy. Rachel Koplowitz used her earnings made by her husband, a tailor for the Red Army, to buy a cot for her child. Koplowitz's memoirs also reveal the continued observance of religious laws with a modern twist. And she's here on the top. I'll talk next about the picture to her right. After her son Jackie was born in 1944, an unnamed Russian midwife helped her find a mole who ritually circumcised her son. Then she took her son to be photographed professionally in Langer Ugel. 5 decades later, nearing the end of a 2-hour, 20-minute interview conducted in the Bronx, she shared the image with posterity. There, held in front of the camera at a tilted angle, was a picture of her naked son. Knitted booties covered his toes, some kind of plant sat behind him, a lacy cloth separated his bare bottom from the table, and natural light streamed in from the left. "This is a picture of my 3-month-old son, circumcised." She said, "I wanted proof to send to my parents that I circumcised my son," unquote. Her parents never saw it. They were probably already exterminated when the picture was taken close to Tashkent. Remnants of early childcare in voices in spaces that no longer exist, and in the things that continue to be carried, infuse the experience of Polish Jews who survived World War II in the Soviet Union. As I tack towards the end of this lecture, I'd like to state that there is much more care to consider when we talk about this other Holocaust. Some of my kind and intelligent colleagues, like Kasia Pearson, Joanna Sliwa, Mary Fraser Kirsch, Franziska Lamp, and Rebecca Clifford, have written about care in convents and monasteries, about care that was care until it was not safe to have a Jewish child in your midst, about care workers who worked in ghetto daycares, about caregivers who shuffled children off in the night and picked them up in the bleary light of early dawn, about care that succeeded and care that failed, and about the extension of care networks after 1945. When you start to think about the Holocaust through the lens of care, it is hard to stop. And of course, questions about care transcend the Holocaust and the 1940s, dissecting the entirety of our shared human past. I've just given a lecture on the Holocaust, but I am not solely a historian of the Holocaust. I am first and foremost a historian of Central and Eastern Europe. This diverse, fascinating, and complicated region is connected to my special chair at Leiden and has intimately been connected to my life since I first took a course with Professor Laurie Kolaski at the College of William and Mary in Virginia in the year 2000, when I was 5 years old. Within this space that extends from Salzburg to St. Petersburg and Sarajevo, I focus on the unique and complicated Jewish civilization that was rooted, for better or for worse here, for hundreds of years, until, at some point, it wasn't anymore. I use this word civilization intentionally. This was a rooted diaspora that belonged to this space despite the persistence of Jewish otherness. In fact, as Milan Kundera reminds us in his 1984 essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, it is impossible to write about Central Europe without engaging with the Jewish voices which reverberated through this region. The Nazis, their collaborators, and on a small but significant scale, some post-war actors who decided that Jewish survivors should be destined for a Jewish polity in the Middle East, uprooted an entire civilization. If my favorite Yiddish saying, ein Mensch ist eine Welt mit kleinen Welten, a person is a world filled with little worlds. If that's true, the void left by 6 million deaths is truly cosmic in scale. This is why the concepts of culture and civilization are embedded into Raphael Lemkin's original definition of genocide, which he coined in 1944. Lemkin wrote about both Polish Christians and Polish Jews. He spoke about the Czechs under Nazi rule and the Armenians slaughtered by the Ottomans as well. The crime of genocide is not only a crime against a people, it's a crime against that people's culture, that people's past, and that people's future. When the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted by the UN General Assembly at the end of 1948, 2 of the 5 preconditions for genocide directly related to care for the very young. Measures intended to prevent births in a group and forcibly transferring children. For Lemkin, genocide was also a biological crime waged against a civilization's children. In the early 1950s, Czesław Miłosz, who I quoted earlier, recognized that the bonds of civilization are fragile. Over the past few years, I have thought about this word fragile, the fragile bonds of civilization. In Polish, kruci. I've thought about this many times. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as the war between Ukraine and Russia continues for more than 1,000 heart-wrenching days, on October 7th, 2023, and in the dizzying months and year that have followed, as I look for updates on the situation in Sudan, which seem very far from the front page of the newspapers that I read. And finally, as political developments in my old home, the United States, and my new homes, Belgium and the Netherlands, put increasing pressure on the fragile bonds that link me to others, and all of us to a shared human civilization. If I pause and marinate there, the despair can be overwhelming. But then, I remember which bonds are really holding our civilization, or any civilization, together. And I think of care, hard work, constant work, the work of the flesh, to borrow from Jill Lepore. And I realize that the magic keeping the stars apart in that lovely E.E. Cummings poem is not only love, but more precisely care. Care that we are willing to give, especially to those fragile little ones in our midst and in our universe. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be here with you today and to recommit to a promise that I made to my colleagues at Leiden, that I will continue to use the privilege of my professorship and my directorship to support other histories that excavate what is fragile, invisible, and overlooked, as well as the brave storytellers, regardless of institutional affiliation or inherited background, who make us reconsider what we think we know about the Central European past, about the Jewish past, and our own complex world. Increasingly, to me, the work of historians like myself should emulate the work of poets. Poets like Wisława Szymborska, who so elegantly reminds us that, quote, in the language of poetry, where every word is weighed, nothing is usual or normal. Not a single stone and not a single cloud above it, not a single day and not a single night after it, and above all, not a single existence, not anyone's existence in the world. Or, as another poet, Dr. Seuss, inspires me and my daughters, a person's a person, no matter how small. Thank you.
If you could just remind us how many children were killed in the Holocaust.
So this is something that I'm actually working on, because I'm not sure we have like the best demographic numbers to indicate how many children at certain ages were killed. So if we imagine, just like from a demographic perspective, that 6 million people defined as Jewish by the Nuremberg laws were killed between 1933 and 1945. If we define childhood up to the age of like 7, right, we can imagine that that needs to be at least like 1 to 1.5 million. But one thing that I think is really important to keep in mind, and this, my demographic work during the interwar period is really helpful here. In 1938, 43% of the Polish Jewish population was under the age of 20. So we're really dealing here with a very young population. And you can see that in other countries as well, in Central and Eastern Europe. So, you know, one of the problems with trying to count very, very young children is they might not have even been registered at any point on a census, because we're not able to find them, right, on like an interwar census if they're born after 1939, after the war has started. If we imagine, let's just think about Auschwitz-Birkenau, of these 1 million people defined as Jews by the Nuremberg laws were killed. If we just imagine that a quarter of them were children, and they needed to have caretakers with them, we very quickly see how this becomes not a minority experience, but a majority experience. So specifically to answer your question, I think the best estimates, children like under the age of 7, around like 1.5 million. But I actually think that number is a bit higher. And a lot of it is going to come down to, you know, how I'm able to know a bit more precise data throughout the war, how many people are having babies. As someone myself who had a child during the COVID-19 pandemic, I know that fertility is not going to stop, even during, you know, a massive global pandemic or a massive global war. So this is something that I'm still working on, because I actually think that our estimates of children, especially the very young children, are too low. I appreciate the question. It's a really important question, and trying to kind of dive deep into the demography of both interwar Jewish communities and also thinking more broadly about what kind of population growth might have happened, right? So if you look at the fertility of Polish Jews in the Soviet Union, they're producing at a much higher rate than Polish Jewish communities in the interwar period. And I think a lot of that is because, to a certain extent, time has stopped, your daily life has stopped, and you simply, let's say, might have more time to think about having kids or being with your kids. One of the things that's very striking from many of the testimonies and interviews that I listened to is how Polish Jews who spent the war in the Soviet Union often remark that this was kind of a great time to have kids, because they had time to be with them. Now, of course, that's not going to be like that within the camp system in Nazi-occupied Europe, but that's one of the very interesting divergences of like the Nazi and Soviet experience.
Sorry, I enjoyed your talk and found it very interesting. I just wanted to mention that if you're familiar with the Canadian War Orphans project that we had in Canada, it's very well known here, but my understanding is that the United States did not have a similar project. That's surprising to me.
So I am familiar with the project. Thank you for reminding all of us that that's like an interesting component in when we're trying to think about how we count children, you know, deal with children who often like don't have their parents anymore. This, of course, is something that's really important in post-war Poland, when oftentimes if somebody had left a child within the care of like a non-Jewish neighbor and they didn't come back, there's a new movie that's out just, I think, this past fall in Poland, which talks about, you know, the crisis of identity of people who find out at a certain point that they are Jewish or they have Jewish roots, or their parents aren't really their parents. The people that raised them for most of their life are not their parents. This is a really, really important phenomenon that the Polish Jewish intellectual Konstanty Gebert talks about quite a bit in his writing. But, you know, I think the ideas of post-war counting, so Dan Stone has new work out which looks at specifically this question of caretakers, external caretakers, social workers who kind of come to Europe with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration and try to kind of set up homes and places for presumed orphans, eventual orphans, because of course people are trying to figure out who has survived and who hasn't. You know, this evidence is really important from the Canadian war orphans, and to the extent I'm actually not sure. I wonder if Hashia Diener talks about this in her wonderful book, We Remember with Reverence and Love in the U.S. Context. It wouldn't surprise me if Canada was doing something more sensitive and more intentional than their southern neighbor. That would not be surprising to me.
Have you seen the movie Blitz? The movie about the London Blitz that just came out?
Which Saoirse Ronan?
the one that's about the 10-year-old boy?
Yes,
and
with
his
Saoirse Ronan. I
mother?
haven't seen it yet, but
So what-
a lot of very attractive people are in that movie, so it's something that's on my list.
Well, what strikes me is it's a depiction of the Blitz from a different perspective, right? So what
Right.
you're doing is looking at the Holocaust through the perspective of care, and here we have a movie depiction, a cinematic depiction of the Blitzkrieg, or the war in Britain
Right.
in 1941 or whatever, through the perspective of the relationship between a mother and a child.
Right.
You know, and it's all about, if you haven't seen it, I don't want to give it away yet, but actually, I'll give it away. It's a Hollywood ending.
Right.
It works out pretty well. But it seems to me this is part of a broader attempt to reimagine the past through the perspective of these unstudied younger people. And
Right.
I just would put a plug in for my book, Queen's Apprentice, which was about looking at the past through the lens of a little girl, right? So it's
Right.
this way of trying to understand. So you were making a claim at the beginning of your talk that this is a major way of reimagining the Holocaust. What are the consequences, do you think, of this?
Right. Thank you so much for the question that I pressed upon you. So I really appreciate that. You know, it's funny because I actually don't think that I'm really writing about something from the child's perspective. So I think in that case, I'm a little further away from this movie, which seems like it's going to be interesting, or, you know, other movies that really kind of think about the child. The obvious one, you know, that comes to mind is Life is Beautiful, right? Fellini's really, you know, beautiful, but perhaps sometimes maudlin and probably unconceivable, but, you know, we'd have to, you know, kind of look a little further into like the documentation of this to see how it would have been possible to really hide a child in those particular circumstances for that long. But, you know, I found myself much more interested in very, very young children because they presented to me such an interesting methodological puzzle. Like, how do you write the history of a group that doesn't have the ability to create documents for you? And then how do you write a history of the people taking care of them, both biological and non-biological caretakers? And I see myself much more in like the tradition of Reinhard Koselleck, to talk really, you know, historiographically. If your historiography students are here, Joe, they'll be excited to hear me say the word historiography. So I define history as the struggle to define the collective importance of the past. So for those of you that don't know the word historiography is basically grappling with this struggle, that historians are creating arguments, they're weighing evidence, they privilege some evidence, they're trying to make an original argument because they need to write a book, because they need to get tenure, and then they need to sell a book, you know, and this type of thing, right? That we don't have like, you know, neutral history. What hopefully we have is nuanced history, right? That's the most that we can strive for. So I was really inspired by conceptual historians. And actually, there's been lots of interesting work done recently on the archaeology of care. So in fact, archaeologists are some of the most forward-thinking intellectuals and academics thinking about care and how we can use tooths of babies to try to figure out, you know, what their nutrition was, like what kind of milk they were drinking, if they were eating other things, et cetera, et cetera. But I just became so interested in the concept of care and this strange reality, which is that we all survived the womb and the first few years of our life, unless I'm lecturing to zombies, which I hope I'm not lecturing to zombies. Someone tell me if there's a zombie in the audience, that, you know, that we all, this is a shared human experience that we all have absolutely no memory of. And if you do have a memory of it, please come and talk to me about that, because I feel like that would be exceptional. So I know this is very basic, so you might be, Sarah, why are you so baffled by this? But it really took me having my own children and the relentless, daily, minutely care that they necessitated for me to be like, I'm totally wrong as a historian. So I often say that my first book was about diplomats, and now my second book is about diapers, because I've just begun to realize that you know, these kind of in-the-weeds, basic human questions that we imagine to be timeless are so incredibly contingent. And for me as a historian, it's the concept of care more so than like the vantage point of the baby or the vantage point of the caretaker. That's more kind of what's animating where I come from, but of course, this has been helpful as I conceptualize what I want to do and what I don't want to do.
I was curious about the whole process, how a historian works. So they study a question and then they look at documents and then they try to figure out some version of the truth that's supported by those documents. And after that, what happens? Like, I guess I could maybe guess a few answers. Maybe it helps with policy making, or it might percolate into movies or books. Could you shed some light on that?
This is such a great question. Thank you so much for bringing it up, because you know, it's something that I struggle with as I'm teaching my students. So at Leiden, for instance, I teach a course called Jews and Judaism, which begins with creation, like the creation of the world, and goes all the way up to the present day. And I say to my students, you know, how can I have like 12 lectures and walk you through 6,000 years of Jewish history? Clearly, I'm making very invasive decisions for all of us. I'm saying where we're starting, I'm saying where we're ending. I wrote the syllabus, I'm telling you what to read. You know, you're coming to class, but you know, I'm doing the lecturing, I'm controlling things. So I think you're right that the sooner that we realize that all the histories that we interact with, being they histories at a museum, being they histories in our textbook, being they histories of like trained historians, being they the stories that we're telling ourselves and our children, that all of these are curated to a certain extent. Now, where I come in as a historian, so number one, nobody is born a historian, right? You're not gonna have like a Good Will Hunting movie about someone like me. You know, I'm not like Matt Damon at the board, able to do like crazy equations just because I was born with it, right? No, it's one of the reasons I chose the career is because it's one of the only careers that like the older that you get, the more cred that you get, right? So the way that you become a historian, well, you can go and you can, you know, get your PhD and blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line, you have to be able to read a lot and see what other people think. And then you have to look very closely and say, okay, all these books have taught me all these great things. What haven't they taught me? Where is the aperture? Where is the hole for further research? And if you can find that, that's step one, right? And then it's about the languages that you read, the documents that you use, how you find those documents. Do you have access to those documents? I'm so worried about the way that we think about Russian history in North America and most of Europe these days, because increasingly we're not able to have access to the archives that we need because so many people cannot go to Russia because they're on like bandlit. You know, so this is so detrimental to how we're going to understand that past, right? And we've been in that situation before, right? So you know, how do historians write something that is thoughtful, meaningful, original, and nuanced? That's the challenge. And that's why I think, you know, I'm always happy when I meet people like on the plane or in a bar or picking up my daughters from school. Oh, I love history. Oh, really? Like, what do you like? Oh, I love the History Channel. I'm like, oh God, that's like what you like? Like, I think it's really good that history is something that people feel drawn to. The bad part about it is that you don't really get to the good part of history until like your third or fourth year in your undergraduate degree, when you get to this historiography. When you come into a class and they say, we want to know who committed, which Nazis, what were they like, what was the background, who were these Nazis that killed Jews in Poland? And they give you Christopher Browning, and he says, well, they were just ordinary men. They could have been any of us. They were socialized in a certain way. And they give you Daniel Goldhag, and he says, no. There's this particular type of eliminationist anti-Semitism that is endemic to the German nation. And you're like, pow. These two guys look at the same set of documents, and they come to vastly different conclusions. And you have to then ask yourself, so how did they do that? Like, what else were they reading? What is their background? And it seems to me like that's where history as like an enterprise and a science becomes so much fun. Because then you're really kind of saying to yourself, this is a past, a human past that we think we kind of know these dates, like know these chronologies, know what happened, right? But then all of a sudden you can get something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are found in the 40s and the 50s, right, in what is modern day the West Bank. And that changes the way that we think about Jews during the Second Temple period when Jesus of Nazareth was alive. So, you know, for historians, we're so dependent on the sources that we have, which is why you have to be an archival hound or a document hound. It's so strange to be a historian, I can't tell you. You need to have so many different skills. You need to be able to go to an archive that might be cold, that might not have a room where you can eat lunch, that might not have like a functioning bathroom, and sit there for 8 hours and talk in a language that's not your own and get documents from the archivist who probably doesn't like you. Then you need to be able to go and talk to like 18 to 22-year-olds and hope that they don't fall asleep during your lecture. Then you have to go to a conference where for like 8 hours or 16 hours in a day, you're surrounded by people and you have to talk about like why your work is important. So you have to be like able to sit still and quiet, able to like give lectures in a dynamic way to keep like the 20-year-olds awake, and then able to like sell yourself to colleagues who probably don't really want to pay attention to you, but they're at the conference anyway trying to meet someone bigger. It takes such a strange mix. I would never encourage someone to be a historian unless it's the best job in the world. Because what unites us as humans, like if you just sit and think about, my God, this is the first time in human history that someone who was not born as a woman can biologically carry a child, right? Thanks to modern medicine. But all the way back, and every parent has had the same experience, or every caretaker has had the same experience holding that little cute baby. Actually, babies are kind of ugly. Holding that little thing in their hand and staring at it while it's crying and being like, what am I going to do? How am I going to survive this? I know that with so much truth, that every parent has done that to their child at some point throughout all of human history. And it's a question and a puzzle that we continue to have to answer. So that's why I think, as Tom LaCour taught me at the University of California, Berkeley, the great historical questions are the questions that seem timeless, that can be answered for any group of people. And then he goes and writes a history of masturbation, a history of Sunday schools, variety, a history of how human beings manage dead bodies, right? These are timeless questions. And those, to me, are the most important questions that historians can answer. It's a great question.
I was thinking of the children's kindertransport and the care that they left and the care that they then had to live with. Has there been any historical or any research done on those? And there were thousands of them.
Thanks, Jillian. There has been some really interesting work done lately by my colleague, Laura Brady, that's B-R-A-D-E, on like reevaluating the kindertransport. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this was a systematic action that was subsidized by a British man to try to move children out of parts of Europe that were either under Nazi occupation or soon to be under Nazi occupation. And there's a large group of children from the former state of Czechoslovakia who are evacuated via the train network and then shipped to England. And you're right, like just imagine, you know, I once had a professor of mine explain the Holocaust to me in the following way. Imagine that you're a child and your parents have to move you somewhere and they can't rely on anyone in your biological family. and they can't rely on anyone in their faith community. Do your parents have somebody in their life that they would trust to take a child and like hide that child or take that child somewhere else? And I think you're right. There's something so incredibly visceral. And what's crazy about the kindertransport is a lot of these kids were very cognizant, right? Because they were older. So they had a sense of, they didn't know everything that was happening, but they had a sense that this was meaningful. And those of you that are interested in beautiful fiction / semi-nonfiction and are interested in learning more about this can check out William Sebald's wonderful book, Austerlitz, which kind of follows the adult form of one of these children who is trying to learn more about his past, but since his family died, is not really able to kind of get to, he's able to like find a family maid, he travels back to Prague, he's always passing through the Antwerp, rail station, which is a train station that I go through a lot on my commute, so I'm always interested and happy to be reminded of the train station in Antwerp and the beautiful clock in the train station in Antwerp. So if you haven't been to Belgium, the train station in Antwerp should be on your list. But Laura Braid's most recent article, I think, is a really good way to understand a bit more about the kindertransport and also how it became this important mode of collective memory in the British context. But again, just to echo back a point that I made in response to Joe's question, I'm really interested in the very, very young. And that's one way that I am able to say something a bit original. That's one way that I'm able to get a book contract, because let's face it, at the end of the day, if you want to write a book, you have to have something original and argumentative to say about something that, if we look at the historiography of the Holocaust, this is something that has exploded, right? So how do you say something not only that will get your book published, but you're trying to say something new. You're trying to say something original. This is what I try to explain to my 6-year-old when she's like, why are you writing again? Didn't you already write a book, Mama? And I have to explain to her, if I understood the strange thing that we call inspiration, I'd probably be a lot richer and a lot smarter. But I don't, right? But I hope that gestures towards an answer to your question. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you so much. Well, as our evening wraps up, let me first invite you to join us out in the lobby for a reception. On the way out to the lobby, of course, you will pass through a fascinating exhibit on children in the Holocaust on these banner posters as you walk out. But please do join us out in the lobby. And please do join me once again in thanking Dr. Sarah Cramsey.